Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the upcoming Listeria changes that are taking effect in July this year. We are delighted to see such a strong interest in this important topic, and we hope you find today's session both informative and practical. So our first speaker this morning is Dr. Mary Lenahan, and Mary is Senior Technical Executive in the Biological Safety Team at the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. In this role, Mary provides technical guidance to food businesses and regulatory authorities on microbiological compliance, shelf life determination and risk assessment. So this morning, Mary's presentation will outline the rationale behind the updated legislation, what is currently changing under the EU microbiological criteria, and what food businesses need to demonstrate compliance, or how they need to demonstrate compliance ahead of the July deadline this year. Then our second speaker, Catherine Cody, is Regional Technical Director at Safina Foods Europe. And here, Catherine leads the food safety team, quality systems and regulatory compliance across multiple sites in Ireland. Catherine's talk this morning will guide us through how Listeria monocytogenes is managed within her organisation, how they're preparing for the upcoming changes, along with practical insights for food businesses. So as Tracy said, we'll begin with Mary's presentation, followed by Catherine. Then we'll move into a Q&A session where Tracy's already mentioned too that Kevin Conley from the Food Standards Agency has kindly agreed to join that to answer any specific questions from Northern Ireland food businesses. So thank you for that, Kevin. And as Tracy also mentioned, if you have any questions throughout the talks, please pop them into the Q&A box that you can see at the bottom of your screen. So I'll hand over to Mary now to get started. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Mary. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see that.
Yeah. We can, thank you.
Yeah, great, okay, thank you. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm going to cover the amendment to the legislation and what it really means for food businesses. So today I thought I'd cover, I suppose, what Listeria monocytogenes is and why it's important that we control this pathogen in ready-to-eat products. I'm going to cover the legislation and the new amendment, what the current legislation is, what will change and why, what will be the impact for food businesses and how can they comply, and then we'll go through some of the shelf life studies that are listed under the Annex 2 of the legislation, Regulation 2073, where the Listeria microbiological criteria are, and we'll finish up with some information and resources. So what is Listeria monocytogenes? Listeriosis is an infection that's caused by the pathogen Listeria monocytogenes. It's usually acquired by eating contaminated food. It's readily cooked by full thorough cooking. Usually infection with Listeria monocytogenes is quite rare, but the reason we're so concerned about Listeria monocytogenes and listeriosis is there's a very high case fatality rate, and the symptoms can be very severe for those people that do get sick. On average in Ireland, we would have between 14 to 22 cases a year. But as I said, people who are in what is considered to be the vulnerable groups, so older adults who are greater than 65 years old, people who have weakened immune systems, for example, people maybe who are living with cancer, and pregnant women are particularly vulnerable to this pathogen and are more likely to experience more severe symptoms. There is a lot of information about Listeria monocytogenes on our own website, on the Food Safety Authority of Ireland's website. And the European Food Safety Authority also have a lovely Listeria monocytogenes story map that really explains it, and this image has come from that. And those links will be sent with the feedback form after the webinar. Okay, so Listeria monocytogenes is also a pathogen that's just widely present in the environment, so it's very difficult to control it particularly if it gets into a food processing factory. It can be endemic in that factory and very difficult to eradicate. Usually food gets contaminated either from raw materials, or it could be present in food that's cooked already as a result of post-process contamination, or if that food is not heated properly. Listeria monocytogenes in particular grows very slowly at refrigeration temperatures. It survives really well in cold environments. And it's kind of those conditions that are really that you normally find in food processing factories is ideal for it to grow and survive. Chilled, ready-to-eat food is more likely to be contaminated, and we have some examples here on the slide. So things like sandwiches, salads, deli meats, soft cheeses, coleslaw. The illness can be it causes two different types of illness, a non-invasive listeriosis and an invasive listeriosis. For some people, they may actually be asymptomatic and not experience any symptoms, or some very mild symptoms. So they might experience a very mild flu-like symptom with some kind of persistent fever, some aches and pains. For some people, that might also be accompanied by gastrointestinal symptoms, so vomiting, diarrhea. But for some people in the vulnerable groups, they are more likely to experience the invasive type of listeriosis, and that usually has a longer incubation period. So people, as I mentioned, older adults in particular, pregnant women, people with diabetes or cancer patients, people who are undergoing certain treatments for different illnesses, pregnant women and their newborn or unborn infants. For those people, they're more likely to experience more severe symptoms, so things like meningitis, septicemia, and in some very rare cases, potentially it can be fatal. For pregnant women in particular, they may experience premature labor or be at risk of miscarriage or meningitis in the newborn. So it's quite a nasty illness, really. So I wanted to show you some of the trends for listeriosis in Europe, and this comes from every year there's an annual report published by the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, and the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, ECDC. And they produce this joint One Health report, usually towards the end of every calendar year. And it gathers the data from all of the member states across the European Union, where they do testing for official control samples for food, but also they look at the human cases and they bring that information all together in a nice report. And looking at that, you can see the trends for listeriosis over 2023. 2024 is the most recent report. So the 2025 report will be published later this year. And you can see, I suppose, listeriosis is the 5th most common infection that's causing foodborne illness. But you can see highlighted here, what I really wanted to show you was in 2023, and then comparing it to 2024, listeriosis cases are increasing. And in particular, if you note, the number of hospitalizations is increasing. So it's becoming more severe. So for 1,551 patients that they had information on, there was 1,497 hospitalized in 2023, compared to just over 1,700 they had information from, and 1,715 were hospitalized in that case. So you can see it's quite a high hospitalization rate. In addition, there's a very high fatality rate, which again, this is increasing. So in 2023, there was 335 deaths. So we had a slight, I suppose, decrease there in 2024, but in terms of outbreaks, we had an increase. And we had 19 outbreaks and 133 cases in 2023, which resulted in 83 hospitalizations and 11 fatalities. In 2024, 38 outbreaks, 210 cases, 149 of those were hospitalized and 17 fatalities. So you can see that the incidence of listeriosis is increasing. Looking at the pattern in Ireland, we're quite steady in around that 2022 number of cases a year. It's not the pathogen that causes the most illnesses. That would be Campylobacter, followed by Shiga toxin-producing E. coli. So our data is similar to the European trends, and you're averaging at around sort of 16 cases a year. But we would expect potentially in the future there may be more cases in Ireland and across Europe. And really looking at the age profile, as health quality of life is improving. People are living well into their 80s and 90s with good health. You can see here, since in the last 10 years, we have had an increase in Ireland of the number of people who are living to over 65. And this is set to continue well into 2057. And in particular, what I wanted to highlight here was that the number of people who are living beyond sort of 80 years and older is set to really increase as time goes on. And really, I know over 65 is a vulnerable group, but particularly when people get to over 75, they're particularly vulnerable to listeriosis and older. So the trend means that there's going to be a larger cohort of people that are potentially more vulnerable to listeriosis from the food that they eat. So for that reason, it's important that the risk of Listeria monocytogenes contamination in ready-to-eat food is controlled and managed to prevent people becoming sick and to protect public health. And this brings me to the reason why the European Commission has introduced this amendment. So Commission Regulation 2024/2895, and it's amending the legislation in Regulation 2073 as regards Listeria monocytogenes. I just wanted to bring you back to the legislation that's currently there. And the legislation for Listeria monocytogenes, the microbiological criteria is set out in Chapter 1 of Regulation 2073 of 2005. It has 3 different microbiological criteria for Listeria monocytogenes. The first category 1.1 is for infants and for foods for special medical purposes, and there's much more stringent criteria there. You have to take 10 samples, and Listeria is not allowed to be in any of those. Category 1.3 is for foods that are considered not able to support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes. So these are foods that have a shelf life of 4 days or less, or if they have a low pH or a low AW, or if there's some other reason, like for example, if it's a frozen product. What I really want to draw your attention to is category 1.2, and this is for Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat food that is able to support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes. And this is where the amendment will take place. So looking at the current legislation, this criteria is unusual in that it kind of has 2 sub-criteria in there. You can refer to them as category 1.2A for 100, the limit is 100 CFU per gram, and 1.2B, not detected in 25 grams. The reason there's 2 different limits is that there's 2 different methods associated with those. For the 100 CFU per gram limit, the method that's used is the enumeration method, and this is a less sensitive method when testing for Listeria monocytogenes. The food sample is taken and put into a diluent, and it is put on special chromogenic agar, and the laboratory are able to count how many Listeria are actually in that sample. When it comes to the detection method, the sample is actually put into a special buffer, and this buffer helps the Listeria monocytogenes, if it's present, to recover and start growing to a level that the lab is able to detect if it's there or not. So for that reason, the first method is a quantitative method, but the second method is a qualitative method. So it'll give you a detected or not detected result. For food businesses that are able to show that Listeria monocytogenes, it might grow in their product, but it won't grow beyond 100 CFU per gram throughout the shelf life of their product. So this is written in footnotes 5 and 7. They can comply with this 100 CFU per gram onto products placed on the market during their shelf life. Currently, in the legislation, that not detected in 25 grams limit actually ends in the legislation, it says before the food has left the immediate control of the food business operator who has produced it. But essentially what that means is at the end of manufacturing. So basically for food businesses, in accordance with footnote 7, that are not able to show that if Listeria is in monocytogenes is in their food, it won't grow beyond 100 CFU per gram. They can comply with this more stringent limit, but that limit finishes currently at the end of manufacturing. So it means there's a legislative gap there. So for these foods, when they're on the market, the criteria defaults back to 100 CFU per gram, which is less sensitive. So currently, if a food is found to have Listeria monocytogenes detected in it, when it's placed on the market, because there is no criteria to assess that result, the risk is assessed under Article 14 for unsafe food in General Food Law Regulation 178 of 2002. So this amendment has been introduced really to plug that gap. So the consultation period for this amendment was way back between April and May of 2024. And industry groups and food businesses and regulators were given a month to give their comments on this introduction of this amendment. The Commission took into consideration those consultation periods and the comments they received, and then the final amendment was published on the 20th of November 2024. The Commission allowed an 18-month transitional period for food businesses to allow them sufficient time to adapt their practices and procedures to implement the new legislative requirement. So we're currently in that transitional period now, and that's set to end soon. And there's an implementation date for this legislation on the 1st of July 2026. And as I said, it will be applicable to that not detected in 25 grams criteria in the food category 1.2. So basically a very small change really at the end of the day. So this, before the food has left the immediate control of the food business operator that has produced it, it will be substituted with the wording products placed on the market during their shelf life. And the associated footnotes will still be there, footnotes 5 and 7, around showing that if Listeria is in your product, how it will grow. As I already mentioned, the reason that this amendment has been introduced is to plug that regulatory gap. So currently that 100 CFU per gram limit only applies when the food business operator can show how Listeria would grow in their product and that it wouldn't grow beyond 100 CFU per gram throughout their product during the shelf life. So at the moment, there's no limit actually where a food business can't show that Listeria monocytogenes won't grow beyond 100 CFU per gram when that product is placed on the market. So the reason the Commission has introduced this legislation, as I said, is to close the gap, but more importantly, it's to ensure consistent control of Listeria monocytogenes across the entire chain. So from the 1st of July, the qualitative, more sensitive detection method will be used to test those category 1.2 foods when the food business is unable to show that the Listeria monocytogenes in that product won't grow beyond 100 CFU per gram throughout its shelf life. And these will be applying to products placed on the market. So when they're tested at manufacturing, but also at wholesale, retail, and import control. I suppose one of the big changes currently in the Republic of Ireland, if official control samples for Listeria monocytogenes are taken for ready-to-eat foods, they are tested using the enumeration method because there's no criteria to assess that result unless there's some reason, for example, if we thought it was associated with an outbreak. So currently we use the enumeration method. From the 1st of July, those official samples will be tested using the detection method, and that result will be assessed for compliance against the new criterion limit that's extended to the end of shelf life. If Listeria monocytogenes is found on those products, we will contact the food business and see if they have evidence to show that it won't grow beyond 100 CFU per gram throughout the shelf life in accordance with footnotes 5 and 7. And if they're unable to show that, those results will be designated as unsatisfactory and there will be appropriate risk management action taken. While I know the introduction of this amendment was seen to be a little bit controversial by some food businesses, really it's kind of clarifying a change that a requirement that was already there, particularly in the footnotes. So currently, food businesses, according to footnotes 5 and 7, could only comply with this 100 CFU per gram if they were able to show that Listeria monocytogenes would not grow beyond 100 CFU per gram during the shelf life. So at the moment, if Listeria monocytogenes is found in a product that's placed on the market using the detection method, that gap is risk assessed using the Article 14 of 178. But I think for the future, it'll be clearer to food businesses to understand what the criteria is, and that both of them go to the same stage. So I suppose for food businesses after the 1st of July, the implications for them, food businesses can still continue to use that not detected in 25 grams criteria to assess compliance when they're testing their foods at the end of manufacturing, which is what a lot of food businesses that fall into category 1.2 are doing currently anyway. But it should be noted for official control samples, and maybe if you are supplying customers and you have some kind of customer specifications where there's agreements about testing, that not detected in 25 grams limit will also apply beyond the manufacturing level. We may see some non-compliance for some food businesses if they don't have robust control programs in place to control the risk of Listeria monocytogenes contamination in their ready-to-eat foods. And Catherine is going to speak a little bit from the food industry perspective and some of the things that they do in their food businesses to control this risk. But I think in terms of public health overall, it will be a better outcome for consumers in terms of controlling that listeriosis risk. And in particular, we can see the age profile of the population is set to increase. So, it's important that we protect our consumers. Just wanted to talk a little bit about the challenges that some food businesses face, and we can understand that, for a lot of food businesses, there's a lot of food safety legislation. It can be very overwhelming. But I would like to remind food businesses that it is their responsibility to produce safe food under Regulation 178. For some small to medium-sized food businesses, they might struggle to understand or comply with the legislation for Listeria monocytogenes, and they may also have limited resources or staff or floor space, maybe some limited funds. But the key message I would like you to take away today is that while the food business operator might be small, the risk of Listeria monocytogenes to your operation and to public health can be large. It's really important as a food business that you understand the risk profile for the ready-to-eat food that you produce. Understanding its physiochemical characteristics, such as its pH, the water activity, understanding your process, understanding whether the type of food that you produce has been linked to outbreaks in the past for listeriosis. And really, while the operation might differ, if the level of technical knowledge might differ, etc., the principles of implementing a good food safety management system remain the same. And it's up to the food business to tailor the situation to your own business and your own operation and what will work for you. So what can food businesses do to ensure compliance? And I see a lot of the time, it's really the basics that food businesses is what's keeping that Listeria monocytogenes risk under control. So critical is to implement a robust supplier control program and a Listeria monocytogenes environmental monitoring program. And really acting, if you find Listeria monocytogenes in your products or in your environment, that you have corrective actions already laid out and you follow those and you get to the root cause of that problem. I would advise food businesses to spend, they might have limited funds, but to spend those wisely, really have a solid prerequisite program and hazard control, critical control point, hazard-based procedures. So really have a strong food safety management system, good staff training, a good hygiene program is vital, a good environmental monitoring program, knowing the risk that maybe is potentially associated with raw materials. And really just understanding the characteristics of your product and how Listeria monocytogenes might grow in your product if it gets in there. And you can do that by following the studies in Annex 2 of Regulation 2073. So in 2073, there is 5 different shelf life studies listed, but I would see them as kind of a part A and a part B. So 1 and 2 fall into part A, and these are things that every food business must do. Part B, which is 3, 4, 5, and on the next slide, these are things that food businesses might do if they feel they're necessary, but they're not obliged to do them. So the things that you must do is really understanding your product. So characterizing your product in terms of its physiochemical characteristics. So its pH, its water activity, you might use salt in there. You might use preservatives. These are types of things that actually you probably already have listed in your specification. It should be relatively inexpensive for you to gather that information and, file it all together to get a good view of what your product is. And particularly, it's important that you build up a profile about the variability of that product. So, maybe taking a pH of every batch, you could buy your own pH meter once you train the staff to use that properly and make sure that it's calibrated. And you kind of build up a profile so you have an idea of what the variability is in your process, in your product. And then using that worst case scenario, you might use that for some of the studies like predictive microbiology on the next slide. Then secondly, looking at the scientific literature and the research data and maybe data about foodborne outbreaks for listeriosis and understanding the risk profile for the product that you're producing. So, is it likely that Listeria monocytogenes will grow in your product? Has there been similar products involved in listeriosis cases previously? And one thing I would say, if you're looking at other products on the market, particularly in terms of how long the shelf life is on those products, make sure you're comparing like with like. So, you might have a product that you pack in air, but your competitor packs it in modified atmosphere packaging and they're getting a longer shelf life, or you're using a preservative and you're not using a preservative in your product. So these are the two steps that really every food business must gather. And you'll be doing this anyway, you should be doing it anyway for your developing your shelf life studies. And then we have these 3 other studies that, again, food businesses don't have to do them, but you may choose to do some of them depending on your product and your process. In particular, I think predictive microbiology is something that we're seeing a bit more food businesses turning to. There are a few tools available. As a competent authority, we don't have a preference for the tool that you use once you know how to use that properly, or if you're using a consultant that they know how to use it properly. So if we are presented with a predictive microbiology study to evaluate, we'll be looking at the tool used and if that tool was used properly, what was the input values, how was that result interpreted, was the result interpretation justified based on the information that you put in. So I would say if you are looking to do some work using predictive microbiology, you need to be competent and understand how to use that tool. Or if you're outsourcing that work to a third party, ensure that they are competent and they understand how to use that tool. So some of the information that you've gathered from steps 1 and 2 will feed into that if you're going to do predictive microbiology, particularly around the physiochemical characteristics. Study 4 is basically where it's a challenge test. So that's basically where you deliberately inoculate a strain that's relevant for your food product or a combination of strains into your food product, and it is held at different temperature profiles to reflect reasonably foreseeable conditions of distribution, storage, and use. And you see how that Listeria monocytogenes might grow over that shelf life that you've assigned to that product, and will it grow beyond 100 CFU per gram? The laboratories that do that are very specialized. In the Republic of Ireland, we don't have any laboratories that are offering this service currently. There are some commercial laboratories in Britain and also in mainland Europe. Food businesses are not obliged to carry this out, but they may choose to do it because the type of product that they have, maybe there is some problems that they can't get control over Listeria monocytogenes contamination in that product, and they want to show that if Listeria monocytogenes is in that, it won't grow beyond 100 CFU per gram. So really it's a business decision for the food business about whether they get that done or not. But I would say maybe try doing predictive microbiology first to see, is it worth going to this? And for some food products, there is no point in spending money getting a challenge test done, because it's just going to show you what you already know from steps 1 and 2 and probably from 3 that Listeria monocytogenes will grow in that product. And then lastly, we have durability studies. Durability studies is where if you had a naturally occurring contamination with Listeria monocytogenes in your product, again, that could be stored over reasonably foreseeable conditions of distribution, storage, and use, to see how that Listeria will grow in your product. Again, you'd have to work with a lab that's competent in carrying out the study and would be able to help you interpret the results. One thing for durability studies, they're more suitable for verification, and the reason for that is because the distribution of bacteria is not uniform. sometimes you might do a lot of testing and actually not find Listeria monocytogenes in your product. So you need to do a lot of testing to find a product that has Listeria monocytogenes in it. And then you need to have a laboratory set up and ready to go, because the logistics of actually carrying out the study are, can be quite complicated. For both the challenge tests and the durability studies, the European Union Reference Lab for Listeria monocytogenes has a document where they specify the protocol that's to be carried out for both of those studies, and that will be used by the competent authority when assessing any studies that are provided to us to show as evidence that Listeria monocytogenes won't grow beyond 100 CFU per gram. So for food businesses, if you have a product that Listeria monocytogenes might occasionally be on that product, and you know that it might grow beyond 100 CFU per gram, what can you do? Firstly, I suppose focus on the basic principles about not letting that product get contaminated with Listeria monocytogenes in the first place. So, making sure that you tick all the basics and get those right. So your hygiene program, cleaning and disinfection, that'll remove it. Don't let it stick in poor fabric or high equipment, but poor hygiene design. Implement robust supplier controls, have a good hygiene program, staff training, and an environmental and food sampling program. Act immediately if you find Listeria monocytogenes in either a raw material or an end product or the environment. So root cause analysis and risk management is critical. And then just to highlight, if you have Listeria monocytogenes in a product and it's not at retail level, it may be suitable for further processing to remove that Listeria monocytogenes risk. And Article 7 of Regulation 2078 permits that once it's authorised by the competent authority. So you might be able to heat treat it and make it into a new product, for example. Longer term options include maybe reformulating the product. So, you might be able to reduce the pH or maybe use some kind of preservative or reduce the water activity, and that would lower the probability for growth. Make sure that the cold chain is maintained to at least less than 5 degrees Celsius, which is the best practice temperature. So while Listeria monocytogenes will grow slowly at refrigeration temperatures, the lower the temperature, the less it will grow. You could implement what's known as a multiple hurdle approach. So maybe depending on your recipe, you can't drop the pH right down or the water activity right down, but maybe you could use a combination of those things that will reduce the growth plus maybe storage of 4 degrees Celsius while it's under the FBO control. For some businesses, potentially it's suitable to reduce the shelf life to 4 days or less, and that would drop you into category 1.3, and you'd be complying with the less stringent limit then of 100 CFU per gram. Or maybe you could reduce the shelf life slightly and combine it with that multiple hurdle approach, so that the basically lowering the impact if Listeria monocytogenes was in your product and the potential for growth. So finishing up now just with some information and resources. So I was on the working group that worked at the European Commission and the European Reference Laboratory to write this quite a comprehensive document. It's a guidance document for food businesses, but also official authorities can use it, also third parties, maybe consultants, laboratories. And it goes through in much more detail what I covered today, and why the amendment was introduced and what food businesses can do to comply and how they can understand the Listeria monocytogenes risk profile for their food. FCI recently published Guidance Note 45. And this is showing you how to implement a robust environmental monitoring program in your facility and what corrective actions to take if you find Listeria monocytogenes in your product. And Catherine, who's joining me after this talk, was one of the food industry people that fed into this document. So we had a big working group that wrote this document, and I think it's quite a nice resource. The European Reference Laboratory for Listeria monocytogenes on their website have a lot of different resources, so I'd recommend to go to that website and have a look. And in particular, they have some nice videos showing how to take swabs for Listeria monocytogenes. And then I thought I'd just mention Guidance Note 44, which is our one on food safety culture, because I think that also really feeds into that ticking the basics and the prerequisite requirements, the HACCP-based procedures, and that you have a food safety culture that really makes sure that the staff understand the risk of Listeria monocytogenes and why the procedures are in place and why they need to follow them. And then, of course, there's always Safefood and FCI always have different webinars and things that you might be interested in. So if you subscribe to the updates, you'll see those coming up. And then lastly, the Food Safety Authority of Ireland have a learning portal, and you can get that there by the QR link. And this has a lot of different resources, a lot of different e-learnings and webinars. And if you haven't been on it, I'd recommend that you join up to it. So in summary, all food businesses are responsible for producing safe food. And while the size of the operation, the level of technical knowledge, etc., might vary, the principles of the food safety management system are the same, and the operation should tailor the plan to their own situation. Spend the resources wisely to address the Listeria monocytogenes risk and really build on those as the years go on. Make sure you have the basics right: good supplier control program, good hygiene program, good staff training, and Listeria monocytogenes environmental monitoring program, etc. Understand your product and what the risk profile is and how Listeria monocytogenes might grow in your product by following those studies and the legislation. And then I suppose just continuously improving and striving to build on existing knowledge to manage and explore the long-term risk, and maybe look at some of the more long-term options you might be able to take in for your product. Okay, so that's me finished. So I am going to hand over to Catherine. And Catherine, you can let me know if you want me to share your slide.